Dear congregation, those in person assembled, and our wider congregation watching online, by now some 70 or 80 households are tuned in on YouTube watching us. Happy Sabbath. This is my second message this year. The first, I reminded you what we're all about. And today I'm going to talk about the subject that's been on my heart for the past 2 years. And I've addressed it already on the first Sabbath when we were in lockdown, March 21st, 2020. But I wonder if anyone even remembers what I said. And so today I get back to this same subject. See, more than 2,000 violent rioters, some armed with stones, others with revolvers, stormed through the streets protesting mandatory vaccination. Let me give you a little background story. In February of 1885, a train rode from Chicago to Montreal, and the conductor of that train, George Longley, arrived at Bonaventure Station feverish and covered with fiery eruptions on his hands, face, chest, and arms. He was put in a hospital, Hotel Dieu in Montreal there. He survived, but his bedding infected Pelagie Robichaud, a Acadian girl who worked in a laundry. She died on April 1st, so it took about a month, and followed soon by her sister Mary. By mid-April, the doctors knew that they had smallpox infection in Montreal hospital. And they made a silly mistake. To save the patients from the hospital, guess what they did? They discharged and sent them home, not thinking that they all got it and it will spread through the city. By September, 2% of Montreal's population was dead. And the city had no choice but announce mandatory vaccination. And that's when riots began. Serious riots in Montreal, 1885. I'm not talking COVID. You realize I'm talking past that. I want to talk some history before we make some sense. You see, it was one of the most contagious and loathsome diseases ever to menace humanity. The saddest part was that in England, 90 years prior, Dr. Edward Jennings already discovered that if you take smallpox from cows and inject them in humans, it triggers the autoimmune response, and so vaccination was practiced. By this time in England, the whole population was vaccinated against smallpox. Unfortunately, you know Canadian attitudes and the attitudes between French and British. Guess who were the doctors in Montreal? The English, the British. And so the impoverished majority of Montreal was suspicious. The slogans were, "Stop killing our children. We would not let you murder our children." Now, I'm not getting into politics here. I'm just sharing some history. Because it's interesting that 90 years later, there are still people who are saying not enough research is done. You see, that was Montreal back then. Today, the attitudes are still there. Human history repeats itself. The anti-vaccine protest slogans, my choice, right? As I look at these pictures, my body, my choice, you know what it also reminds me? These are the same slogan carried by abortionists. Does it bother you? My body, my choice, just think of that because I'm coming somewhere. This attitude, I'm in charge of me, actually has much more deeper history, deeper roots, and older origins. My body, my choice. I call my own shots. Not going to make any comments on this because it may be associated with something else. Even this week, not knowing what I will preach on, I got some posts and emails about the tax that Quebec is planning to impose on unvaccinated. Friends, this is nothing new. Jacobson versus Massachusetts, United States, 1905, Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court, 7-2, has voted to uphold the authority of the state to enforce compulsory vaccination laws. What year? 1905. I'm just giving some history before we get into scripture. The city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, could fine residents who refused to receive smallpox injections. In 1902, Pastor Henning Jacobson, somehow pastors always think they know better. And I'm commenting knowing there's some doctors in the audience. The pastor started anti-vaccination campaign and went all the way to Supreme Court. Now you ask, why is it significant? Because during that same time, in the Supreme Court, there were Seventh-day Adventists, and you probably recognize the name of A.T. Jones, fighting for the religious right of believers to uphold their Sabbath observance. And guess how much A.T. Jones said about vaccination? Nothing. Guess how much Ellen White spoke about vaccination? Any thoughts? Any ideas? Nothing. Why? You see, there is no word regarding violating one's liberty or conscience on freedom of choice. Why? It's not only because it was a different top priority for them. Let me give you a bit more history. Some of you heard of Willie White, Ellen White's youngest boy. He was asked directly this question: did she write on vaccination? And so his answer was, I don't remember my mother ever saying or writing that she had any special instructions regarding vaccination. To paraphrase it, he was saying basically there was no prophetic revelation on this subject. Now let me ask you, if this would be significant for end-time events, do you think God would reveal it through His spirit of prophecy? Huh? Because God does not do anything without first revealing it to His servants' prophets. And yet there is nothing said about it. Now then he shared his personal story. As a child, his mother shared with him that he was in good health until he was vaccinated. Have you heard those stories? I myself, and I'm going on the record, advise parents with young children not to vaccinate them immediately, month or 2 or 3 or 6, even as doctors prescribe. Even my own kids were vaccinated a bit later, giving time for the little body to grow, to gain some weight, to become stronger, to battle those responses. Now, I'm not getting in that detail. This is what he shares, his personal story. When I was vaccinated, my health became impaired. But later, mother listened attentively to the arguments that the methods of vaccination has been improved, and when in our travels we brought to a large city where smallpox was raging, and a matter was discussed as to whether or not I and my associates, including herself, should be vaccinated, she offered no objections, and guess what? They're all vaccinated. This is coming from her son, Willie. Now, this picture is from 1913 Elmshaven. This is the staff of Elmshaven, and on the bottom left, you see a young man sitting there, D.E. Robinson. He would later become Ellen White's grandson-in-law. He married her granddaughter. He says this later in the mid-60s when polio was raging, and the same debate was taking place in our churches. Should we be vaccinated? You ask for the definite and concise information regarding what Sister White wrote about vaccination and serum. This question can be answered very briefly, for so far as we have any records, she did not refer to them in any of her writings. You will be interested to know, however, that at the time when there was an epidemic of smallpox in the vicinity, she herself was vaccinated and urged her helpers, those connected with her, to be vaccinated. Now, listen to this. In taking this step, Sister White recognized the fact that it has been proven that vaccination either rendered one immune from smallpox or greatly lightened its effects if one does calm down with it. She also recognized the danger of their exposing others if they fail to take this precaution. Friends, if I would do right now a whole seminar on the attitude of Adventist pioneers and Adventist leaders through the past years, the concern was not so much about myself and my survival, but not endangering others. Thinking of well-being of others and thinking of the burden we put on the whole health system if we do not follow the remedies that are offered to us. Let me give you another evidence. Some of you heard of Arthur White. He's the author of the 6-volume biography of Ellen White, her grandson. During the polio outbreak in the 60s, he says, I think of missionaries who went out in earlier years of work, some of whom thought it was violation of principle to be vaccinated. So that attitude was always there. They were cut down with disease and filled early graves, giving virtually no service to the mission field. Would it not have been much more pleasing to God for them to have taken the steps which would have prevented their succumbing to these dread diseases? And then he tells a personal story of an Adventist doctor who went to North Africa, refused to be vaccinated, did not refuse to be vaccinated. They received a limited number of vaccines. And as a doctor, guess what he did? He made sure he vaccinated all the people he could, did not vaccinate himself and succumb to it. And at that time, he was in an iron lung. And so he was sharing that story. Now, why am I talking about this? Almost 2 years ago, March 21st, when I preached to you, I shared with you about Operation White Coat. Do you remember it? Some of you remember that sermon. Operation White Coat, there's been a documentary recently made about it. It was a medical research carried by United States Army between 54 and 73. The mission was to prepare defenses against the possibility of biological warfare. And the Army recognized that for them to have uninhibited results, they need healthy men. And guess where they found those healthy men among? Any guess? Seventh-day Adventist Church. They contacted our General Conference headquarters and said, you have a lot of men who refuse to carry a weapon. They're conscientious objectors in U.S. Army. So at this time, Vietnam draft, you all know, Korean War, Vietnam. And Adventist men said, we'll go to the field, but as medical personnel, as support, but we would not carry arms. And so they're considered conscientious objectors. And so the medical doctor said, if you want to help us through this way. I said before, many Adventists know about 2,300 days, but don't know about 2,300 men who participated in this research through the years. And this research has done a lot. I mean, I've just got 2 pages of notes here. Q fever, tularemia, yellow fever, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, hepatitis, plagues, Rift Valley fever. The antidote for Rift Valley fever was a major factor in sealing the peace accord between Israel and Egypt in 1977. What's interesting, none of the white coats, as they call them, died through this time. All the men who participated in that did well. Some of them are still alive. There's been recently a reunion gathering of these men who thought they were sacrificing their lives for medical research. And at that time, there was an uproar in the pews that the General Conference collaborated with government to do the research. But guess what the emphasis was? For the better of humanity. I find it interesting that when COVID started in England, they offered 4,400 British pounds, that's about 7,400 Canadian dollars, for volunteers who would step up and help to discover vaccine and antibodies. And you know what? They had 20,000 volunteers. Now I'm saying, how much more courage should have those who know God is in control? And if you were to watch that documentary on white coats, you hear the testimonies of these men. They did it knowing that ultimately God is in charge. And if they are doing this for the sake of humanity, God would bless them and protect them. Now, friends, I know we're all emotional about this because we are at that peak of the 4th wave here in Canada. As I look at other countries, they're also peaking. Some are getting over. I just pull some of the most populous countries that we have representation in our congregation, and you probably recognize your flags there, right? Somewhere it's yet to hit. As I look at the projections, India has to brace itself. It's yet to come in full force. In the United States, it's peaking, and there's no sign of that wave slowing down. Same in Philippines, and these are just recent updates. Some countries, they just got over the third wave, so they have no clue what is yet to come. By God's grace, we're realizing this fourth wave is not as lethal, but also the fact that so many people have been immunized is making a difference. And now I want you to turn to Jesus' prophecy. Is that all right? I've done enough prelim talk. Let's get to the Bible. And if you paid attention to your Bibles, you noticed that Angelo, thank you for reading, Angelo skipped the word. Did you notice that? How many of you noticed that? In Matthew chapter 24, verses 7 and 8, Angelo skipped the word. Now, we're not going to blame Angelo. He did it because of the translation he used. Some translation omit the word pestilence. But see, that prophecy of Jesus is recorded in two places, Matthew 24 and Luke 21. And so we have the second evidence, Luke 21, verse 11, there's a word there that is translated as pestilence. Now you may say, why did they omit? I invite you to take a look at the Greek here. Are you okay with Greek? We're going to look at Greek here. There's two Greek words that are very similar. Limoi, famine, and loimoi, disease. Now, if you're a scribe and you're writing the manuscript and you write limoi, loimoi, is that a possibility that somehow you may skip that word? And that's what happened. Some manuscripts skipped that word. But see, Luke 21:11 has both words in there in all existing manuscripts. So we know that Jesus talked not only about the famines, but what? This loimoi, the pestilences that will happen toward the end. Now you would say, why is it significant? Why is Jesus mentioning pestilences before? Well, here's the reason. Prior to Christ, history did not know any pandemics. Are you aware of that? Now, when we talk about the pandemics, we could consider medical, social, but I leave that for others. Yes, we know that pandemics impact economics and politics. Yes, we know that from medical perspective, we could spend hours talking here about spread and cure and causes. This is not our focus. Our focus is what? Theological, philosophical, biblical. Where's God in it? Why is it happening? As I mentioned already, there were no pandemics before Christ. The two known plagues, major plagues in history that we know, is the plagues poured out on Egypt during Exodus. You all know the story, right? You all know the story of Exodus, the plagues. And then something that hit Sennacherib's army when they were besieging Jerusalem. What is interesting that Sennacherib army, before besieging Jerusalem, went down to, you want to guess where? Egypt. That's where the plagues originated. And so as they were coming up, back, surrounded Jerusalem, the whole army was already diseased. In 700 BC, over 185 Assyrian troops died. And historians all agree on that. It's been recorded in many different histories. There is a speculation on what caused it, what was that the mice was carrying, what happened there. All we know, they besieged the city, and recently as we study Isaiah, you remember, we'll look at that. They all recognized there was a plague because the Assyrian army literally never recovered after that. But see, those were epidemics. They're contained within a certain location. It's only after Christ that we now experience what we call pandemics. And pandemics is something totally different. That's why Christ, revealing to John what will happen in the future, he calls his attention to this pale horse. Remember that horse? By the way, the Greek, there's no pale, it's green horse, chloros. It's that kind of greenish, palish horse that has a rider on it called death. And it's interesting that when you look at Revelation prophetically, you recognize that that coincides with the dark ages of Christianity, which we call Middle Ages or medieval times. Now let me give you a little perspective on history, because that is not just a coincidence, because the church at that time lived in superstition and ignorance. And now, friends, I want you to pay attention to the history. The first plague is known as Justinian plague, major plague. Some of you wonder who's Justinian. He is the emperor who implemented laws that would lead to creation of Holy Roman Empire. His canon laws would govern Europe for the next 1260 years. Have you heard that date before in Bible studies? 1260 years. This is the emperor who declared to the whole Christian world that they have to be obedient to one man who is the vicar of God on earth, and that man alone is the father of all believers. Do you see what's happening? I'm just putting a time frame. It's in his reign that a plague would arrive. Guess from which country? From Egypt. A ship carrying the grain to Constantinople also brought some rats, and plague began, killing about a fifth of the population in Constantinople, in the capital city. Historian Procopius records thousands dying daily. The true number will probably never be known, estimated to 10,000 per day in the capital city. I've seen on YouTube those video clips where do like comparison of how city developed through the years. Have you seen those clips? And you just watch. And it's interesting to see that Rome declines, Constantinople grows, and then all of a sudden Constantinople declines and other cities grow. You look at the dates. This plague literally destroyed the city. He noted that because there was no room to bury the dead, the bodies were stacked in the open. Funeral rites were abandoned, unattended to. Entire city smelled like the dead. Just the first wave killed over 100 million in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, researchers today are still digging and studying. In 2013, they confirmed that there was a particular pestis that originated at the borders of China and Kyrgyzstan in Tian Shan Mountains. Disease returned 4 times in 4 waves. Did you hear again how many waves? 4 waves. In a bit slower progression than what we're experiencing, but there are 4 waves coming and going. In later centuries, it would again hit in different places. In Constantinople, it returned in 7th, in the 8th, 9th century. And scholars are studying this about this disease. There was a particular monk, Vargius Scholasticus. He's more known to us as the guy who outlined the 7 deadly sins. He was a church historian, legal advisor to Pope Gregory. He lived through those 4 waves, and he lost his loved ones. He was born in the first wave, lost his wife in the second wave, later on his child and other children. So he lived through that, and he records a lot of that. What troubles me that through the time of these waves, the church did not get the message. The church did not repent. The church did not say, maybe something is wrong, because guess what? The church people were also suffering through it. I look at the history of the church. It's through this time Pope Gregory is introducing purgatory, unbiblical. In 607, for the first time, the title is used, the Holy Father. Prayers to Virgin Queen of Heaven and dead saints were introduced during this time. Kissing Pope's foot began. And I'm reciting this because, friends, sometimes people are turning in the wrong direction, seeking the remedy and not finding it. Another plague that would erupt later, during the time of Crusades. Anyone wants to guess what plague hit Europe? For almost 200 years, and it was coming in waves during Crusades. Anyone knows? Heard about it? No, that's later. That's bubonic. That's coming. Leprosy. Have you heard of that? Leprosy hit Europe with every crusade. What's interesting, before that, leprosy was totally dormant. They go on the crusades, leprosy resurrects. The king of Jerusalem at that time, Baldwin IV, was the leper, and because he wanted to hide his leprosy, guess what he did? He wore an iron mask to hide his disfigured leper face. In fact, the whole order of crusaders would wear these masks. They were lepers, and they would assist. In Europe, by 13th century, there were 19,000 lazarets because of leprosy, leprosariums. The moment crusades stopped, guess what happened to leprosy? Disappeared. How do you explain that? Now, I've heard already the Black Plague, so let's go to the next pandemic, known as Black or bubonic plague. There's a swelling in the groins, lymph nodes are swollen. It started in 1320 in China, spread to Mongolia and India, and then this is the time of Mongols and Tatars moving west. They arrived to what today is Ukraine, Crimea, and at that time, European kingdoms of Genoa and Venice were big traders, and they had their establishments in Crimea. And so as the Tatars besiege the city in Crimea, they decide to use an interesting weapon, the city of Kaffa. They would take their dead soldiers from this disease, and they would catapult them as weapons into the city to start the pandemic. When the soldiers in the city realized what's happening, they got in their ships and fled and brought it with them to Europe. Within a century, this disease claimed over 400 million lives. Just think of the numbers. This little tiny pestilence, loimoi, this tiny fly causing so much death. How do we know about it? Because of mass burials that are dated to that time, as archaeologists are digging to understand what was happening. 31%, now put that in perspective, 31% of European population died within 4 years, and it is evidenced by the cemeteries. Venice lost 100,000 in 2 years. 70% of their population. Do you remember the city? Because I'm going to come back to this. Venice lost 70% of its population in those years. Now, have we suffered anything of that significance yet? I'm going somewhere with this. The capital city of papacy at the time in France, Avignon, where papacy moved the capital because popes were French, so they didn't feel like being in Italy, Rome was not important. The 7 successive popes ruled from Avignon. It hit the city, and in 7 months, 150,000 people died. They're just dumped in the river Rhone. Beautiful city, but that's part of the history. That plague would hit every country, and it would return from time to time. In England, in 1360s, killed 20% of Londoners, came back 9 years later, killed another 15% of population. In China, in 1331 and 1350s, in Hebei and Shaanxi and other provinces, it's been considered by Chinese scholars who are looking at that from 50 to 90% of local population, running in tens of millions. During that time, 60% of Norway died from 1348 to 1350. I hope these numbers are causing you a somber reflection. When Jesus says that in the times toward the end, there would be serious pestilences. Now, this was just a third plague. London, England, at that time, was hit every 20 years with another wave. I find it interesting. Some of you probably heard that phrase, "No man is an island." It comes from British poet, philosopher, doctor, John Donne. And he has written his devotionals because he was there ministering to dying people in need. And last year, Philip Yancey, many of you heard of him as an author, he simply took his devotionals, paraphrased them into 21st century language, and published them as a book, A Compassion in Crisis, the bestseller right now, a bestseller, sold in millions, and it's simply a paraphrased 5th century old devotional on living through crisis. It was not until London burned in the year 1666 that the pandemic has ended. Now, people feared the sick. Relatives would abandon the diseased. Historians describe that parents would not respond to their children's cries. Just imagine that, because they're afraid to get sick. Isolation was required by authorities, and guards were posted at the apartments, guarding that people would not exit to the street. So if you're complaining about measures today, you're just laughing, okay? The restrictions that they experienced back then were a whole different level. And the church, during this period, redirected the blame to blame others. There are a few suggestions. One, we're not religious enough. At this time, flagellation became popular. People would walk on the streets beating themselves with whips, with those cat claws, ripping their skin, thinking that they could plead with God, saying, "Look how we're punishing ourselves, take this disease away." Is this what God requires of us? Self-flagellation? You see how not understanding God and His will would cause the wrong approach. This was a ritual. Joint processions would be out there doing that, and in the process only multiplying contagion. There's another extreme, and that's what I wonder may be happening today: debauchery, comedy and entertainment. Just forget about it, just party. We'll die tomorrow, right? And some preachers even quoted the Bible. Isaiah 22:13 says, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for we shall die tomorrow." So that's what the Bible says. Let's party. Who cares about pandemic? Now, some of those attitudes are still present today. But speaking of the blame, remember I mentioned Venice? In Venice at that time was the largest population of the Jews. And so what Venetians did, they noticed that the Jews are not dying. They are dying, Jews are not dying, so they put them in a ghetto. So Hitler did not start ghettos. The term ghetto started in Venice in 14th century during the Black Plague. Since then, over 500 cities in Europe repeated it, massacring, destroying, expelling the Jews. And one of the attitudes they had, if they're not dying, they might be part of it. They're probably doing something to us. A myth was popularized that Jews are poisoning our wells with a disease. Do you know what Jews were not dying? They read Book of Leviticus. They simply followed God-given laws of sanitation, of washing hands, of not touching the dead, or if you touch the dead, not returning back to anything without washing first, and so on. By the way, it's in that time the term quarantine was established. From Latin quarento, the 40, because as the sailors would arrive, they would keep them in the sea for 40 days to see if the ship was carrying the disease. And so even though they were blaming the Jews, some of them start reading the scripture, paying attention, trying to understand. But I find funny that sometimes superstitions would cause even more reaction. At that time in France, the Pope himself, Gregory IX, in his bull, in the official document, the vox in Rama, the voice heard in Rama, blame it on cats. Why? Well, they may be demons. And it's funny because these things that would destroy the pest, the mice and rats, were burned. And for the next few centuries, that was an entertainment to catch and burn and skin. And I'm going to leave this because some of you may be sensitive to the images, but that's a reality. Now, if you worry about wearing these masks, imagine these masks. That's what doctors back in the day wore as a mask. And it's coming back. Recently, someone found on the street walking with this type of mask. See, they would put some incense stuff in those beaks and some herbs that they would smell the air filtered through that, understanding that some of this could be probably transmitted by the air. And it's interesting that the church, science, and academia were silent. They had no understanding why. Instead, they persecuted true believers. These are the times when Waldenses were persecuted. These are the times when Wycliffe and John Huss were burned. So even as pandemic raging, instead of getting on their knees and seeking answers from God, they're blaming and persecuting others. When we look at these dates, I find it interesting that this plague came 1,000 years after Constantine. You say, why is it significant? Because the church came to believe that millennium has already taken place on earth. That the Holy Church was the fulfillment of God's kingdom on earth. And they were hit with this plague. Now I find it interesting that after the discovery of Americas, are you paying attention to the dates? And friends, I want you to start thinking in your mind, are those coincidences? After the discovery of Americas, Europe was hit with another plague of syphilis. Recently, there was a documentary and researchers are talking that Columbus's real discovery was actually syphilis. And even religious establishments were hit by this. The number of successive popes died from it. Makes you wonder about lifestyle. I'm not going there. I want to bring another name that you would recognize, and you recognize his funny haircut, right? The guy by name Martin Luther. He starts the Reformation, and the plague, bubonic plague, arrives in his town. Just think now about the doubts. He went against the church, he started Reformation, and now his town is hit. The year 1527, Wittenberg, plague broke out. Speculations of opponents. He and his pregnant wife, a former nun, Martin Luther, a monk, married a nun, Catherine. She's pregnant with their baby, and the plague is at the door. They move out of the city to the village, but he goes and ministers and writes and continues encouraging believers, do not fear the plague. Care for each other in the name of Jesus. In this time, he writes a letter or a pamphlet, whatever you put it. Back in the day, they had no social media and TV, so they used to write lengthy messages and preach lengthy sermons. So he writes this, titled, Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague. 2 years ago, when pandemic began, I read 4 paragraphs. Not going to read all of them, just going to give you highlights. His focus was, whoever does not love his brother is a murderer. You know why he was saying this? Because parents were not attending to their sick children. Because young families were not visiting their old families in fear of pandemic. And that's what Martin Luther wrote. Trying to take all the stigma away, that instead of hiding that you've got the virus, just keep serving as much as you can. And he reminded the believers of the words of Jesus, I was sick and you did not visit me, as the words of condemnation. And he wrote there, devil's game is to induce such fear and dread that we would run from it, or in turn to minimize it. You see, take courage and spite and annoy him. Send those terrors right back to him and say, I've got two heavy blows against you. The first one, I know that in helping my neighbor is well-pleasing to God. If you can terrorize, Christ could strengthen me. If you can kill, Christ can give me life. You will not have the last word. These are writings of Martin Luther. And the second blow against the devil is God's mighty promise by which he encourages those who minister to the needy. Blessed is he who considers the poor. The Lord will deliver him in the day of trouble and pestilence. Quoting Psalm 41. He also warned about sinning on the right hand. And friends, my dear church present here, those watching online, Martin Luther said, do not sin on the right hand. This is what he meant. There are people who rush and reckless, tempting God and disregarding everything which might counteract death and the plague. They disdain the use of medicines. Are you seeing this? How long ago it's been? Over 500 years. Martin Luther was warning believers, don't do this. They say that it is God's punishment, and if he wants to protect them, he can do so without medicine or our carefulness. This is not trusting God, but tempting him. And then Martin Luther writes this, God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. And this is direct quotation. It says, I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer the medicine, and take it. I think I could stop right there. But notice the end. Perchance infect and pollute the others. The concern was, again, on who? The others. The fifth major pandemic was influenza. Beginning of the 20th century, and I'm going to run quickly. That was the first of the three H1N1 pandemics. It infected 550 million. Did you hear that? Almost 500 million. That's 1/3 of the population at the time. Nearly 30% of the world population was infected. The estimates put the death toll at 50 million. That is 10% mortality, or 3% of the global population dying from that. Some suggest possibly as high as 100 million, raising that percentage to 5. You want to guess how waves before it stopped from 18 to 20? Only after the fourth wave, influenza subsided, gaining that crowd immunity. In comparison to the pandemics of the past, and these are just some pictures from those years, because we have this temptation, it's happening to us now, poor us. They had it worse before. In those years, British paper called that deadliest virus ever known. This is from Canada, from Kelowna, a public notice of lockdowns. So don't be surprised, nothing new. Churchless Day is planned here. The same agitators that exist today existed back then and tried to make it political, make it religious, make it mark of the beast and everything else, missing the point that that's something Jesus predicted and prophesied, that plagues, pestilences, pandemics will become common. These are just few snapshots, friends. I want this to sink in. Now, when we compare, these are the major that I shared with you, right? Black plague, bubonic, Spanish flu, influenza, plague of Justinian. So when we look at what's happening now, it's not one of the most significant. You could say, yet. So we are in the sixth pandemic. Notice I skipped one, major one. It's right on this chart, AIDS. How many of you talking right now about AIDS pandemic? Do you realize that in the city of Windsor, more people carry AIDS than been infected with COVID? Does it ever occur to you? I mean, I'm talking, look at numbers. But see, there's been so much media agitation, so much fear pumped that we're crowning the virus. Don't put that crown on the virus. Now, I understand that transmission is different and all that, but so we are in the sixth pandemic. And so I'm asking myself, do we look at it from perspective, why is God permitting this? What is God trying to say to us? As of right now, 321 million people are affected. 5.6 million are dead. Are we learning anything? Are we getting anything from it? Could it be just like in the past history? God is trying to reset because we are reaching that red line. We are at the threshold of something so terrible that God is slowing everything down, putting the brakes because the work is not done yet. Because God still got some time for the message to continue to be preached. Let's not kid ourselves, worse things are yet to come. Do you realize that the next pandemic, whatever it will be, is inevitable? We live through this, things are yet to come. In 2017, Time magazine was already warning that we're not ready for the next pandemic. I'm going to repeat that warning. As much as we're handling COVID right now, we are not ready for the next pandemic. The things will yet come and will be even worse. But friends, we must not live in fear. Some people act as if there was no death before COVID. I have a sad news for you. Sin brought in death. And people were dying before, and people will die until Jesus comes and says, "Oh death, where is your sting?" The day is coming when this will be over. And I find more people are concerned about COVID than about sin pandemic in their lives. You could get vaccinated from COVID, but there's only one vaccine for sin, and that's Jesus Christ alone. Now, book of Revelation, chapter 16, gives much more terrible prediction. It tells that the plagues that would be poured out are of the whole different level. Do we even get what's happening there? And then it would be late. You cannot get vaccinated even against sin because the door of probation, the door of mercy would be completely closed. And so what we're going through right now, God is simply pulling the e-brake on maybe, slowing things down, pressing a reset button that we could ask, how is my relationship with God? Am I sincere? Am I playing games? Because God alone could give peace. And I want to turn this in conclusion. Same chapter where Jesus says there will be pandemics. There will be pestilences. In the same chapter, he warns that there will be false prophets who will try to commit even the elect. So let me put it this way. Jesus is saying, you believers who think you've got it, you have to be careful because the devil would work hard among you trying to mess with your minds. That's his plan. There are false prophets that are entangling even Adventist believers in believing wrong stuff about mark of the beast and vaccination and everything else. How do I know? By the number of emails I get as a pastor on these issues. Now you may say, well, what does it mean? Let me ask you, how did Satan deceive the universe? What did he use? Do you remember? The Bible says prophetically he used his tail to sweep 1/3 of the stars. If you read biblically, what is the tail? Tail is a lie. The Bible is consistent that tail is a symbol for the lie. How did Satan deceive? With his lies. He lied and lied and lied again. And so, friends, I want to read this passage. I read recently in one of the morning devotionals. This comes from Great Controversy, page 495. Leaving his place, speaking of Satan, in the immediate presence of God, Lucifer went forth to diffuse the spirit of discontent among angels, working with mysterious secrecy and for a time concealing his real purpose. under an appearance of reverence for God, he endeavored to excite dissatisfaction concerning the laws that govern heavenly beings, intimating that they imposed unnecessary restraint. Are you relating to this? Satan is saying to the holy angels, God's strict rules and regulations are unfair. You should be free to do as you please. She continues, since their natures were holy, he argued, the angels should obey the dictates of their own will. He sought to create sympathy for himself by representing that God had dealt unjustly with him in bestowing supreme honor upon Christ. He claimed that in aspiring to greater power and honor, he was not aiming at self-exaltation, but was seeking to secure liberty for all the inhabitants in heaven. That by this means they might attain to a higher state of existence. Are you hearing these slogans? Freedom of choice, liberty of conscience. Those were battle cries of Satan in heaven, telling to angels, you are holy, how could you be wrong? If you feel that you should do this and that, no restrictions from God, no regulations from God, you should not obey any of that. Freedom of choice and liberty of conscience are ploys of the Satan. By insinuating, assuming, accusing, suggesting, he infiltrated. Remember that? And these are the 4 points that he used to induce suspicion in the angel. Number 1, instill suspicion in God's government. Create distrust in any news coming from it. Do you relate to what's happening today? Don't trust the government. Don't trust the news. Make it appear that there's a sinister hidden plot to take away freedom. Create an atmosphere where liberty of conscience is threatened. And final, make it appear that if you don't act quickly, your eternal servitude is at hand. Ellen White says this, friends. Our people need to be silent upon a question which have no relations to the third angel's message. Let me ask you, to vaccinate or not vaccinate, that's any to do with three angels' message? We just went through 10 days of prayer focusing on the three angels' message. She says, if ever a people needed to draw near to God, it is Seventh-day Adventist. There have been wonderful devices and plans made. A burning desire has taken hold of men and women to proclaim something or bind up with something they don't know what. But the silence of Christ upon many subjects was true eloquence. So friends, this is once and the last time I'm going to speak on this subject, because we have to preach three angels' message and not get distracted by these things. And then she gives another interesting warning. Our work is not to make a raid on the government, but to prepare people to stand in the great day of the Lord. The fewer attacks we make on authorities and powers, the more work we will do for God. Make sense? Makes a lot of sense. Not only that, she warns us that as we come to the end, we would be scrutinized. Our words would be twisted. A new meaning would be added to what we say. And if we as a church get engaged in these things, it would be, today nothing disappears. Everything on the Facebook, YouTube, anything is out there. And if we take a wrong stand on this subject, it would be used against us when we preach the three angels' message later on. When we speak about the true liberty of conscience when it comes to the matters of the Sabbath. Friends, what is more important to us? The issue of vaccines or the question of Sabbath? And so I want to come to this final statement as the praise team is coming, as we would sing, God be with you until we meet again. Romans were brutal. You read about Romans, right? Romans were nothing like our governments. They're brutal. Jesus never taught to rebel, did he? In the midst of all that pandemic of Roman occupation, in the midst of all that abuse, if you say, and friends, I'm not denying that the means that we're experiencing right now may be a borderline abuse. You hearing me? So don't argue with me saying pastor tells us to bow and obey. No, that's not my argument. I'm thinking of Jesus, who says, you know, if the Roman comes and asks you to give him a coat, take the coat, take the shirt, take under the shirt, give it to him. If they come and ask you to walk 1 mile, walk how many? Go 2. And as I read this, I thought to myself, maybe Jesus, if he would stand today, say, if they ask you to take that shot for the public's sake, he would say, take 2. Maybe take even the booster too.